The Forging of the Old Lady, a Narrative History of the Bank of England's Founding. Introduction, A Kingdom in Monetary Chaos. History seldom offers a perfect confluence of crisis and opportunity, yet late 17th century England provided just such a crucible. As the tectonic plates of European economic power shifted north from the Mediterranean to the Netherlands, England found itself in a precarious and volatile position. The nation's finances were in disarray, and its monetary system had descended into chaos. The rampant practice of coin clipping had debased the currency, while unregulated goldsmiths, acting as de facto bankers, charged usurious interest rates that crippled commerce and fueled public discontent. It was from this crucible of financial instability and strategic necessity that the conditions for a radical new institution emerged, an institution whose establishment was not just possible, but had become inevitable. The crucible of creation, England before the bank. The late 17th century found England at a critical crossroads, besieged by a confluence of financial pressures that demanded a new solution. The period was fertile ground for radical innovation, shaped by three powerful forces: the influential financial model of the Dutch, particularly their public Bank of Amsterdam, the political upheaval following the Glorious Revolution, which had placed a Dutch prince on the English throne, and the incessant, ruinous cost of war, which drove the state to the brink of insolvency. The English monetary system itself was in a state of near collapse. The widespread practice of coin clipping, shaving metal from the edges of coins, a crime known in Italian sources as svassatura, had become a national scourge. By the mid-1690s, this systematic theft had devalued the circulating currency by as much as 50%, undermining the very foundations of the economy. The government's attempts to halt the practice were desperate and ineffective. Rewards were offered for the arrest of a clipper, and captured offenders were publicly executed, yet the problem persisted unabated. In this unregulated environment, a class of merchants known as the goldsmiths, Orafi, had risen to prominence. They functioned as the nation's private, unregulated bankers, but their practices made them deeply unpopular. Charging exorbitant interest rates of 30% to 80% on small loans, they profited immensely from the instability they helped create. This perfect storm of a debased currency, predatory lending, and the state's desperate need for funds did not create a simple demand for a new order, but rather a chaotic and vibrant intellectual search for a solution. Between 1650 and 1710, at least 60 different proposals were advanced, with competing ideas for land banks, nominal currency, and even negative interest rates vying for political attention. The architects of a new order. The creation of the Bank of England was no accident of history. It was the result of a deliberate and brilliantly executed plan conceived by a small group of politically connected visionaries. These men possessed the financial acumen, political savvy, and powerful networks necessary to transform a radical idea into a national institution, forming a perfectly complementary team. The principal architect of the proposal was William Paterson, a Scottish financier with a deep understanding of European finance. His experience was enriched by close relationships with the wealthy Jewish communities of London and Amsterdam, and he possessed intimate knowledge of the inner workings of the Bank of Amsterdam. He was the financial visionary with the continental expertise to design the machine. The political mastermind who navigated the plan through a treacherous parliament was Charles Montagu, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. A member of a family that had held influential positions in England for 5 centuries, Montagu was the political insider who could maneuver through the corridors of power. He championed the bill, skillfully leveraging the government's desperate financial situation to overcome opposition and ensure its passage. Securing the support of the powerful merchant class of the City of London was the task of Michael Godfrey, a wealthy and respected merchant. Godfrey was the city consensus builder, working tirelessly to rally the merchant capital essential for the project's success. His efforts were rewarded when he was later elected the bank's first deputy governor. These key figures were united by their political allegiance to the Whig Party and their loyalty to the Dutch king, William III. The king's costly and protracted wars against France provided the immediate and undeniable pretext for the bank's establishment, creating the political will to embrace such a revolutionary financial experiment. With the visionary, the political operator, and the merchant consensus builder aligned, the stage was set for the execution of their groundbreaking plan. The birth of a Titan, the founding of 1694. On July 27, 1694, the Bank of England was officially born. This date marks a pivotal moment not just in British history, but in the financial history of the world. It signaled the legal institutionalization of permanent public debt and the creation of a powerful new form of money, fundamentally altering the relationship between the state and private finance. The legislative process that created the bank was a masterclass in political maneuvering. To avoid attracting widespread debate and organized opposition, the act authorizing the bank's creation was quietly embedded as a single clause within a routine fiscal bill concerning the tonnage of ships. As William Paterson's biographer later noted, the true name of a private society was avoided for prudence. This stealthy approach allowed the revolutionary proposal to pass into law with minimal scrutiny. The bank's founding charter established a clear and innovative financial structure. Its initial capital was to be £1,200,000, raised from private subscribers in the form of gold and bullion. The entirety of this sum was to be immediately loaned to the government of King William III to finance his war efforts, at a generous interest rate of 8%. The true genius and controversy of the model lay in the mechanism that followed. In exchange for the loan, the bank was granted the legal authority to issue its own banknotes for an equivalent amount of £1.2 million. Crucially, these notes were not backed by the bank's gold reserves, as that gold was now in the government's possession. Instead, the banknotes were backed by the government's debt to the bank. This structure allowed the bank to effectively create money from nothing, using public debt itself as the reserve asset. This was the institutional alchemy that turned the state's liability, its debt, into a private corporation's primary asset, allowing the bank to create a new money supply backed not by the tangible value of its own gold, but by the intangible promise of future tax revenues. The power behind the throne, the first shareholders and directors. Far from being a public institution, the Bank of England was from its inception a private corporation owned and controlled by a small, interconnected elite. Its first shareholders were a who's who of the era's most powerful merchants, financiers, and politicians, who stood to profit directly from the very state indebtedness they were helping to create. The subscription drive to raise the initial capital of £1.2 million was a resounding success. £300,000 was raised on the first day, £600,000 within 3 days, and the full amount was subscribed by 1,520 individuals in just those few weeks in July 1694. The bank's first board of directors was composed of figures who dominated the economic and political life of the nation. To be eligible for election as a director or governor, an individual had to hold at least £2,000 in the bank's stock, a high barrier to entry that ensured control remained firmly in the hands of its wealthiest investors. Sir John Hublon, the bank's first governor. He was a wealthy merchant, an importer of port wine, a director of the powerful British East India Company, and master of the Grocers' Company, one of London's most powerful livery companies. Michael Godfrey, the first deputy governor. A prominent merchant and a key architect of the bank's creation, his family invested a substantial £18,000 in the new venture. The Hublon family, a financial dynasty of immense influence. The family collectively subscribed over £25,000 and held numerous powerful positions, including seats in Parliament and directorships in the Levant Company. Sir James Bateman, the largest single subscriber. The son of a Flemish immigrant, Bateman rose to become one of the greatest financiers of his time and would later serve as a director of the South Sea Company. King William III and Queen Mary, the monarchs themselves were major shareholders, subscribing £10,000. This positioned the Crown as both a primary borrower from the bank and a primary creditor of its own government's debt. Other notable directors. The board included figures like Sir Henry Furness, a member of the Drapers' Company, William Scoran, a banker, Sir Theodore Junson, a French financier, and Charles Montague himself. These men were overwhelmingly tied to the Whig Party, held seats in Parliament, and were deeply enmeshed in the powerful livery companies that controlled London's commerce. This created a perfectly closed loop of power. Whig parliamentarians voted to fund wars, which created public debt. That debt was then purchased by the Bank of England, whose primary shareholders were those same Whig parliamentarians, who then collected the interest paid by the very taxpayers they represented. This profound conflict of interest established a powerful and self-perpetuating cycle of war, debt, and private profit that would shape the nation's destiny. Trials by fire, the bank's first decade. Like any revolutionary entity, the Bank of England did not enter the world unchallenged. Its first decade was a brutal fight for survival against the vested interests of the old order, as it faced formidable political opposition, fierce competition, and a near-fatal financial crisis. Opposition came swiftly from two powerful quarters, the Tory party and the established goldsmiths. The Tories, representing the interests of the landed aristocracy, were deeply suspicious of this new form of financial power that was not tied to land. The goldsmiths, meanwhile, saw the bank as a direct and existential threat to their lucrative, if unregulated, banking business. This opposition coalesced into a direct challenge with the establishment of a rival institution, the Chamberlain Land Bank, in April 1696. Championed by the Tories, this bank was based on a different model, using land as its reserve asset. However, the venture was a catastrophic failure. It aimed to raise £2.5 million in capital but managed to attract only £7,100, of which an ironic £5,000 was subscribed by King William III himself, hedging his bets. Its swift collapse had the unintended effect of strengthening the Bank of England's claim to financial primacy. The bank soon faced its own existential crisis. In 1696, a government effort to recoin the debased currency triggered a public rush to redeem banknotes for gold. Lacking sufficient reserves, the bank was forced to suspend payments, a move that could have been fatal. It survived only through a new capital injection from its wealthy shareholders and, critically, the unwavering support of its powerful allies in Parliament. A final, audacious attack came in 1707, led by the prominent goldsmith Sir Francis Childs. The goldsmiths attempted to orchestrate a bank run by collectively presenting £30,000 in notes for immediate redemption. The bank's response was as daring as it was effective, it simply refused to pay the goldsmiths while continuing to honor the redemption requests of its other customers. This bold maneuver thwarted the attack and cast the bank as a defender of ordinary citizens against a disgruntled cartel. Having survived these early challenges, the bank was poised to begin its long, deliberate march toward absolute financial dominance. The Long March to Dominance, 1708 to 1844. Over the course of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Bank of England methodically evolved from a powerful private corporation into the indispensable financial engine of the British state and its burgeoning empire. Earned with great patience and skill, its position was solidified through a series of calculated moves. The bank proved masterful at never letting a crisis go to waste, using each of the Crown's desperate pleas for war financing as a ratchet to tighten its grip on the nation's finances. A series of major conflicts provided the catalysts for this consolidation of power. 1708, War of the Spanish Succession. The bank's charter was renewed. In return for new loans, it was granted a partial monopoly on banknote issuance by a decree prohibiting any other English bank with more than 6 shareholders from issuing its own paper money. This brilliantly targeted measure effectively crippled the development of rival joint stock banks while leaving smaller partnerships intact. 1781, American Revolutionary War. Facing another costly conflict, the government again turned to the bank. The charter was renewed in exchange for a new loan of £2 million at a favourable 3% interest rate, further solidifying the bank's position as the state's primary creditor. 1793 to 1815, Napoleonic Wars. This period of prolonged warfare led to an unprecedented explosion of public debt, which soared to 250% of the national income by 1816. Prime Minister William Pitt, in his desperation for funds, bypassed parliamentary approval to secure direct financing from the bank. A critical turning point occurred on February 27, 1797. Facing a potential collapse from a wartime panic and dwindling gold reserves, the government, at the bank's own request, took the extraordinary step of suspending the gold convertibility of its banknotes. This restriction period lasted for nearly 25 years, demonstrating conclusively that the value of the currency was ultimately based not on precious metal, but on the authority of the state. The bank's long journey culminated with the landmark Bank Charter Act of 1844, commonly known as Peel's Act. This legislation formally separated the bank into 2 distinct divisions, an issue department, which would manage the banknote supply backed by government debt and bullion, and a banking department, which would operate as a commercial bank, thereby isolating the nation's money creation from its private lending activities. Crucially, the Act solidified the Bank of England's absolute monopoly on the issuance of any new banknotes in England and Wales. Exactly 150 years after its controversial birth, the Bank of England was transformed from a contested private venture into the unassailable pillar of the British financial system. Conclusion: the legacy of a financial revolution. The establishment of the Bank of England was more than the creation of a new financial institution, it was a revolution that fundamentally reshaped the modern world. Born from political intrigue and the desperate need to finance a war, this private corporation institutionalized the concept of permanent national debt, transforming it from a temporary crisis measure into a central feature of the modern state. Its pioneering model, creating money backed not by gold, but by the government's own debt, unleashed a torrent of credit that fueled Britain's industrial revolution and financed the expansion of its global empire. In doing so, the Bank of England forged the essential blueprint for modern central banking, a model that, in various forms, would eventually be adopted across the globe, forever altering the intricate and powerful relationship between money, private finance, and the state.